Welcome, everyone, to the last session of our study on prayer. It's been, I think, a very provocative and rich conversation in these first 5 sessions. And today, we're sort of wrapping it up, even though I think we all understand that there's no sort of easy way to wrap up a conversation like this. But we're going to bring it to its own sense of conclusion, recognizing that the story very clearly continues. But before we get into some introductory comments on our last session today, I left you last week with something to chew on. And it was the idea of how do we show in our prayer life a similar persistence that we do in going after the things we strive for or want in this life. What reflections did you see, and do you actually find yourself willing to kind of be persistent and and stick with it and really sacrifice in terms of your sense of prayer and connection to God, even when things maybe don't turn out, I guess, in ways that you hope or long for? Just any reflections on that idea, that comparison of persistence in our prayer as it relates to persistence in other areas of our lives? Horty.
What has remained with me and resonated with me very profoundly this week is from the reading of last week of Abide. And that may not be quite as assertive as what you're excuse me, what you're seeking discussion of right now. But when things aren't going just right, abiding is an effort. And to maintain the steadfast belief, opinion, idea, and practice of intending to abide when things feel rather obstreperous was an interesting exercise for me throughout the week. And it mattered a great deal. It mattered a great deal to me. And as I feel like I usually believe and state and live, prayer doesn't change God, but prayer sure changes me.
Yeah.
And I found that really important and really helpful this week.
And that's been a lot of our work, hasn't it? Is really opening up our perspectives on what prayer is and our relationship to it. And I actually think your naming of that metaphor again is so spot on. I think it is very appropriate, because I don't know about all of you, but when in a lot of times in my life, and I'd heard about that, I am the vine, you are the branches, abide in me. I sort of, the picture that would come to my head was was like a narrow view of a vine like this, maybe about the size of this frame, like my arm. And then here's me. But I still was a picture of God and me, it kind of like that. And what this class has invited me to is to kind of like draw back and widen that perspective, as we said in the first class, kind of go in as best we can into that God's eye view. And the more I've done that, the more I've realized that I don't produce fruit outside of all of us producing fruit. We're all connected to that vine. So when I'm looking at the narrow view, it seems like me and God. It's easy to think or to recognize or, to get stuck in, well, if I'm not producing fruit, then something's wrong with my relationship with the vine, or something like that. The narrower our view, the more challenging it can be. Not that it's not challenging to broaden it, but that's where I've been feeling. So I love your calling us back to that image, that abiding in, because it's tough. Go ahead.
She was away from home too when this happened.
That she was thinking of such brilliant things that she had the time to be present and reflective. Is that what you're saying?
No, not exactly.
Okay. No, but thank you for that starter, Horty. Anyone else with reflections on the relationship between persistence that you found in your prayer life and persistence in other areas of your life? So, yes, Carol.
Well, this goes back prior to moving up here. I remember things at work were just, they were just so bad. And I found myself driving to work every day, just verbally praying out loud. And I just remember one day I got so loud in the car and I came to a stoplight and I just heard God say, "You don't have to yell. I hear you." And 5 years later, after all that chaos, I just said, you know what? I'm done with it. Retired early, and that's how I found you guys. So I think you were the answer to that prayer. It took a while, though.
What a beautiful perspective. But yeah, it's like and that was related to persistence there. And in a sense, I love that you reached that point in your car, because that itself was still a prayer. And that's kind of what we've been talking about. It's just this way of being with God that is more about a relationship than I don't know what we'd call it, I don't know, we've used the vending machine term, but just like, that it's not just something we go to when we want something. It's really it's a way of being connected. And that singular little expression of anger or exasperation, and then that sort of thing you heard, it just, yeah, it speaks to me. Thank you. Patty?
Muted. Oh.
There you go.
I recently joined the Board of Ministries, and I don't know very much about the depth of the program, but I'm going to be somebody who's going to be a communication person and talking to or providing information to our newsletter and to the congregation about what we're doing. And I was thinking about that in terms of prayer and realized that the Board of Ministries is working for the ministers in our church, and every one of us is a minister. And I never thought of it that way, but Christianity calls people to ministry. It calls that whenever we give money, whenever we work in the garden, whenever we do anything that we do, we're coming together in community on that vine you're talking about, and all the tendrils that we are going together. We're joining. And I had never thought that I was a minister by giving money or time, or that all of us were, or that Christianity was about that. But it's so evident, and it's like, wow, Patty, where were you? But that was happening because I was thinking and praying that I would do a decent job on this Board of Ministries, because there's so much for me to learn about it. And that was so comforting. And then I thought, we made God into community by the Trinity, but maybe we recognize God in community by the Trinity. The Trinity is a community and invites us to see things through that lens. And those were things that came to me. I don't feel ever away from prayer. I mean, if ever I have a problem, it goes to prayer. That's how it is, because that's what I do. I have formal times, but they're not as productive as the informal ones, I think. Maybe they are. Who knows how things work? That's part of the mysteries, I guess. But that part of being in the ministry committee is part of prayer for me.
Yeah, as is, I think, gatherings like this, to come and talk about the topics, Bible studies, and all the ways. And it really, as we practice and we broaden and it ripples out our understanding of what prayer is, it really can incorporate some of the areas that we may have previously compartmentalized as being not or they are or whatever. So that's an important piece, I think, in terms of our sense of persistence. It's not just persistence in praying one way, but our persistence in expanding our whole perception of where God is and where I am in relation to God. And the more we do that, I think the more we find what you just named so beautifully. And I am thrilled to know that you are sort of engaged in this role with the board of, we call it Board of Community Ministries, but it truly is ministries because it's global, the global community. But I think it's really wonderful because you, by being a communicator like that, are really helping the church stay engaged in that aspect of our prayer life together and inviting people into a deeper experience of it, perhaps. And that's always of benefit. So thank you. Anyone else? Any other reflections initially on the homework from last week? There's ways that our conversation today is going to pick up on some of this stuff, so we don't need to linger too long. In fact, why don't I just jump in? So, in these first 5 sessions, we've grappled with a lot of aspects of prayer, the impact of prayer. How do we pray? What do we do when prayer doesn't go the way we think it should? Or, what are some of the problems we experience with prayer? All that sort of stuff. And now we're arriving at, I don't know if it's the penultimate question, but it's really, we're back where we started in a sense. And it's like, does prayer actually change anything? And Horty named something that I think we all can resonate with. It certainly, it changes us. But I want to go into that a little bit more with each of you, because there's more than that too. I found some interesting data, some reflections, some writings. There's a lot of writings on prayer, but I found something that really struck me, and it was written in 1936 by the Nobel Prize winner in medicine. He was a French physician. His name is Dr. Alexis Carrel. And even back then in 1936, way back in 1936, he presented this study that talked about sort of the physical efficacy of prayer and the act of just the posture itself. Being in the posture, prayer hands, bent knees, slower breathing, the health benefits of it. And he talked about it more than that in deeper sort of an emotional level. As a physician, he wasn't quite going on a spiritual level, but he was talking about this emotional level of it helps us resolve inner conflicts. It relieves us of guilt. It helps us overcome sort of negativism, paralyzing negativism. And he talked about it as if, it's really a sort of, as we express things in prayer, the physical act and the speaking of prayer, it's sort of like a self-induced therapy. And he named it as that. And it struck me on a lot of levels, because I was like, I know a lot of people who practice yoga today with that sort of approach. There's a lot of new age practices that have really embraced that attitude, that there's physical benefits to prayer or to these practices. So that's why we do them. And yet there must be more. From a Christian perspective, I wonder, is there more? And I say that also knowing that the context of Dr. Carrel writing those words in 1936 in France, what was about to happen in Europe is striking and sobering in terms of that particular perspective on prayer. So I hold that, I offer that. And then I come to one of my very favorite authors, priests, theologians, Henry Nouwen, who wrote very succinctly, and I'll share with you his quote that I found here. He says, "Nobody has to prove to me that prayer makes a difference. Without prayer, I become irritable, tired, heavy of heart, and I lose the spirit who directs my attention to the needs of others instead of my own. Without prayer, my attention moves to my own preoccupation." And there's something that strikes me, in terms of that initial conversation we had about the vine. It's like without prayer, our view gets narrower. And maybe we lose that sense of connection to something greater, the vine that's larger. We become self-absorbed. We become a lot of things that distracted, disconnected, those kinds of things that he named, that I think we can relate to. And so as we consider this, what is it? How is it? What is it about, prayer? What does prayer do? Knowing that we're not going to come up with a comprehensive list of all the things, but the invitation of this class has been to reflect on in our own lives. What does prayer do? And maybe we've had some transition or transformation in that idea over this class. But today we're going to look at what happens when we pray, what changes occur in light of prayer, and how our expectations about the difference that prayer can make can change according to what our expectations, how our expectations of what prayer can do can influence our assessment of how effective prayer can be, what the difference it can make is. So what are our expectations of what prayer is supposed to do? So that's kind of where we'll go today. We'll see where the conversation takes us. And before we get into readings, I'd like to ask for any sort of reflections you have as you come to this question of, does prayer actually change anything? Horty.
I know there are a lot of nurses in this group, so this is probably a familiar ground, but there have been studies done of people, particularly in critical care situations, who have been prayed for unknowingly. And there have been studies done where these people are prayed for and these people are not. And the difference, even in the amount of pain medications that's documentable, that were required to manage those people's comfort. And I remember first reading some of those studies early ago, and not being surprised, but being delightfully astounded that it was documentable. That's what it's supposed to be in the scientific community.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember reading those articles and books too, and it's pretty stunning. And one of them that changed the way I approach a lot of my pastoral care, in terms of when I speak with people who are in the hospital and maybe going through, about to go through any kind of procedure. And the book, I remember it was called The Scalpel and the Silver Bear, and it focused on Native peoples in, I believe it was New Mexico or Arizona. But the central point that I'm recalling was that people, when they knew they had a reason to wake up and that someone cared that they did, it made a big difference in how their bodies received the trauma of surgery, essentially. And so it's just made me say, I look forward to seeing you when you wake up, or when the surgery is over, or that sort of thing. And just to offer that as a means of saying, someone cares that you do. And it's not to, I don't know, it's just something that really stayed with me. And I think what you named from a nursing perspective, from a pastoral care perspective, is really meaningful, that it does somehow make a difference. Anyone else? Yes, Bertie.
When I was 11, my mother was hospitalized with polio, and she also was 8 months pregnant with her fourth child.
Wow.
And one morning she was just feeling, really terrible. And she kept wondering, is my child going to be okay? Am I ever going to be able to walk again? Will I be able to care for my family? And she was just really anxious about all of this. And then all of a sudden, she was overcome with peace and a feeling that, everything will work out okay. And we learned later that this was a Sunday morning and the church had been praying for her. And it's affected my way of thinking about our communal prayers that we have, and they really can be effective.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And what we'll be talking about, and what this raises, is what's the nature of that effectiveness? Because I agree with you. I have no doubt that prayer on a communal level and an individual level makes a profound difference. And yet we also, I think, would recognize that just because there are 100,000 or 100 million people praying for something doesn't sort of twist the arm of God or something, or twist the laws of nature, but it does something. And so that's what we're going to talk a little bit more about that. Yeah. or maybe some of you do think, I mean, I think there are some that we've been raised to think that idea of when millions of people pray, it just creates this, this something that's it's, I don't know, it bends, it can shift the arc of the universe, and perhaps it does, but maybe in different ways than we've come to understand in our, previous learnings. Any other initial comments before we get into the readings?
I saw on the news this morning that there are units of Russian army that are withdrawing. And I think there were probably a lot of people praying that would happen.
I'm glad to hear that. I had seen some initial, comments about that. I'm glad to actually hear that it's happening. I hope that, I hope that continues. Thank you. Yeah, and we can pray for that. And we'll talk about pray. What does it mean when we pray for something, and what happens when we do that? Okay. Can I have 4 volunteers for our readings? They're brief again. Oh, and I wanted to say I had written down Acts 2, 33 to 35 or something. That was a typo. So I have it corrected here. It's a little bit of a longer passage, but it's one I think you'll find familiar. But I'm sorry about that. I made a mistake with my Acts passage. So we've got 4 passages, all fairly brief. Could I get 4 volunteers for reading? Kathleen?
I'd like to read the Psalms.
Okay, so Bob, you want to read the Psalm? Is that all right, Kathleen? Then you can go second. Okay, so Bob, then Kathleen, and then who? Thank you, Bonnie. Bonnie's third. And last but not least, it is who is going to do it for the grand prize. There you go. Carol wins. Remember your orders, friends. Okay, remember the order of reading if you don't mind. Okay, so we'll start with the Psalm, Bob. Oh, we need your volume on.
Sorry, forgot. I'll do it for you. Let me hear of your steadfast love in the morning, for in you I put my trust. Teach me the way I should go, for to you lift up my soul. Teach me to do your will, for you are my God. Let your good spirit lead me on a level path.
Matthew 6, 9 through 13. Pray then in this way: Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we also have forgiven our debtors. And do not bring us to the time of trial, but rescue us from the evil one.
And that should sound very familiar to everyone since we just did that, but I wanted to call our attention back to that prayer and back to some of the assessments we had about that prayer. All right, Acts 2. You're still muted, Bonnie.
I clicked it. Okay.
There you go.
Acts 2, 42 to 47. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers. Awe came upon everyone because many wonders and signs were being done by the apostles. All who believed were together and had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all as any had need. Day by day, as they spent much time together in the temple, they broke bread at home and ate their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having the goodwill of all the people. And day by day, the Lord added to the number those who were being saved.
Thank you.
James 2, 15 to 17. If a brother or sister is naked and lacks daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, keep warm, and eat your fill, and yet you do not supply their bodily needs, what is it the good of that? So faith by itself, if it has no works, is dead.
We can come back to those if need be as we discuss this, but they're pretty, I think there's a lot of familiarity with these passages, obviously. Okay, so with those as the grist for the conversation, let's start by asking, in your lives to this point, to this period in your life, maybe just even before this class, what do you normally expect when you pray and ask that God's will be done when it pertains to a specific concern? What's your expectation when you ask God's will to be done? Go ahead, Bonnie.
I don't know if this was the right interpretation or not, and I've questioned it many times since, but I have mentioned before that when my father was dying, that I was praying, and I did pray for God's will, but of course, I wanted him to get well, and it didn't happen. And so afterwards, I had to say, well, the comfort to me was that was God's will. That was what was supposed to have happened. And in more recent times, I'm like, well, do I know that? Was that really God's will? My mother was in the early stages of Alzheimer's, so my father was spared from seeing her go through all of that. And so was that God's will that he wouldn't have to experience that? And I guess I am still at this point. I mean, you ask for God's will and then something happens. And so, okay, that's why that happened, I still, sometimes I don't know. I can think of several other instances, and I won't go through, experiences of my life, but I sometimes questions afterwards, well, that's what I thought at the time. That was how that was supposed to turn out because that was God's will, but is that really right? And sometimes I still don't know.
No, thank you for once again, kind of these accessible and relatable reflections, Bonnie. It is a lot of us, our whole lives grapple with what does that mean when we talk about God's will? And one of the things I want to draw us back to by including the Lord's Prayer is that sense that what we talked about there was that God's will was not just something that happens to us, but it's something in which we participate to help shape. So to say God's will be done, it's not just God's will be done in the abstract. No, the specific prayer is God's will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So God's will be done in our realm, just as it is in all the expanse that's beyond this realm. Let's not bother with saying, oh, in heaven is a specific place, in anywhere that we have no conception of, because that's truly what is represented by heaven outside of this life kind of thing. So in a sense, that prayer invites us into deep partnership, and so that's where God's will can happen, is in partnership. We've talked many times, in the Gospels, particularly in the Gospel of Mark, no healings happen outside of partnership. Jesus does not one-way street the healings. Okay, it's always about the relationship, the connection, the faith, the some sort of act of initiation and welcome to allow the healing to happen through the relationship with Jesus. Okay, so there's something there. So that whole idea of, God's will, it's still a mystery, don't get me wrong, but there's something about, a partnership. And then if that's so, as our faith lives develop or as we continue down the path, in what ways does praying for God's will change when we recognize that we really are in a partnership? Patty?
When I think of God's will, I think of it more as God's way or design. And I think of that idea of bringing to earth as it is in heaven. For me, it's bringing to me an understanding more of what God's way is. The design of the design of a life that brings life more abundant is God's way. And so mostly what I feel like I do now, I used to pray for stuff, things. Please don't let my daughter die. Please don't let me die. But don't let my late husband die. Whatever. Don't let my other husband go away. Those things. But I don't do that anymore. Right now I pray more to understand what I'm supposed to understand. And that seems like a cop-out in some ways, but it's quieting. And it also makes me feel curious to know what it is that God is and how that unfolds to me. I don't feel pressured anymore. Sometimes I feel scared because I can't get it fast enough. But mostly I feel, because I've had a lot of stuff in my life that isn't good, and I've survived it and realized that I'm a survivor and curious, I'm not as worried anymore. I'm worried a little bit, I worried terribly about the stuff in Ukraine this week and prayed a lot about that. So I do worry about that. But there's another part of me that just says, okay, how am I supposed to learn what it means to bring heaven on earth? How do I do it with all these people in our church? How do we do it through our ministry with all the people in the world?
Yeah.
How do we do that? I don't know, and I may never know. But if I keep asking the question, something will happen. And usually the somethings that happen is not what I expect, but it's interesting and calming.
Yeah. And if our prayer is intended to help us to see with the eyes of God, whatever it is, whatever the specifics that we're praying for, then as we stay engaged with that ostensibly, we will learn what that means. And I think you said it so beautifully. We don't always know. And in fact, it's best that way. We don't know how it's going to play out. And so there's the wonder there. So while we can have some intentions, let's not get too tied to outcome or agenda, perhaps, because that can lead us down a path that maybe prayer and healing might be another, showing us another way. And then we can get ourselves into that position once again of trying to manipulate, and control our prayer rather than staying connected to that greater vine, which has tendrils every which way. Thank you, Patty. Any other comments about that? Yes, Horty.
We've talked about this statement before, and I think it has some relevance here, and that is, healing is not always the absence of disease. And that's a bigger, broader perspective than that someone gets well. It's where is the healing that's possible, even in a way that this may touch people I don't even know, members of a family of someone that I'm caring for, whatever. It's not always some miraculous change. That doesn't mean healing isn't happening, isn't about to happen, isn't touching some part of the situation that's beyond our, I always say, perfect understanding is not in my job description.
Yeah. Right. And that's what we're faced with. And to say that is not a flip. It's not an easy thing to say what you just said. It's a way of saying, I can't know all the mystery. And so sometimes we fall into this pattern of acting like we can, though, even though we might say that with our head, we'll sort of like do things that sort of like, well, I can, and it's like, no, we can't know. And we know that life is full of tragedy and pain. And each one of you probably has things you're aware of that you are still learning how to heal from. In terms of, things that really wounded you and left a mark. And yet, oftentimes with a broader perspective, a deeper experience of life as we've gone down the path, there is something within that has represented some measure of healing. And we are not promised a pain-free life. It's just not life. We're promised life. And we have an opportunity to live life in an abundant way. And I think many of us, we have this expectation that, here's what that means to me. An abundant life means, and that's where, what we're talking about here. Some of the challenges are our definitions are feeling tied to outcomes. It just represents that sense of control and longing to find a sense of order that may or may not exist. And that's not satisfying, but it's life. But it gives us a chance to say, all right, so God is here in this moment still. How? How is it? And be open to that wonder and that revelation to find us. And that does often take persistence. There's no question, because a lot of us go through long periods of difficulty in seeing it. Any other thoughts or reflections on that one? Yeah, Margaret.
Every morning when I wake and I see God in every part of the world, the sky, the trees, the birds, and everything, I think how great He is. And the Bible tells us to thank Him. And I do, because I'm really impressed with God. And then when I pray, I find peace. I really do. I'm okay.
Yeah. And just the act of saying thank you, Margaret, puts us in that position of broadening our sense of perspective, like we're talking about it. It kind of helps us have a little bit more of a God's eye view. To thank God for the experience of a sunset or a flower or a breath or this day, it absolutely keeps us in that position that sort of Henry Nouwen was talking about, where we kind of can just, it hedges against our tendency to want to go inside or to be fully just self-occupied all the time. So it's a really important thing. And the mystics have long said, if the only prayer you ever say is thank you, it is enough. And I think that's true, because it really is a perspective broadener, a bit Bonnie, and then I think I saw Patty too.
We've had spectacular sunsets lately. And last night it was just especially breathtaking. I pulled off the side of the road and took a picture, and I just said, this is, and Bob was with me, I kept saying, look at this, look at this, look at this. And then this morning, as I'm looking at my kitchen window, I see the full moon. I don't know if last night was a full moon, but it was awfully close to it. And then I just watched it as it set. And it was just beautiful. And it just reminded me of the faithfulness of God, that, we have sunsets every day. Well, sometimes it's cloudy, but, the sun comes up, the sun goes down. Sometimes we have a spectacular sunrise or sunset. The moons come up, the whole full moon every month. All of that, all that whole pattern, it's always there. And I believe that it's God that has created this to, and it's important for us to, or at least it's important for me to not be so busy that I just run through life and I don't even notice it, because it's always there and it's really a gift. Yeah. And I'll say one more thing real quick. My cousin just published a book called Shifting Shorelines, and she lives on Marco Island down in Florida, right as you go into the Everglades. And reading her book, it was Messages to a Younger Self. And she writes about what she would tell herself, her younger self. But I was amazed at how she is so aware of the ocean, of all the shells, of every little creature she sees. And she takes walks daily, and she talks about these different shells. And I was like, I would walk right down the beach and say, there's a bunch of shells here, but she knows each and every one. And, and it was a beautiful read. I thought, oh, boy, Terry, I didn't know all this about you. But it isn't really, I wouldn't, she doesn't mention God, she mentions the universe, but it's very much, to me, had to do a lot with getting in tune with nature and getting in tune with what is around you and being aware of it. And, that's something I'm trying to really, not be so busy that I don't even notice it when it's right in front of me every day.
Yes, yes, yes. Thank you. That is a beautiful reflection. And yeah, you're speaking to all of us. I think that is such a profound prayer, to find the ability to be present, to be aware, to be mindful of where we are in the midst of what we're doing and what we're planning and the other stuff, the busyness, because it helps slow down time and it helps us appreciate things that we might just take for granted otherwise. And it's vital. Otherwise, we can just go through our days and they're like a blur. It's like what many of us do. We take our kids to school every morning. I'm not that present for that drive. And like many of you, probably in your various commutes, if you're doing the same thing every day, sometimes you think back and you're like, oh, I don't really remember what I was thinking or seeing or doing in the midst of that drive. You just sort of get there because we're not really paying attention to it. And it becomes so familiar. But in your cousin's perspective, that beach then becomes familiar, and that island, and it's familiar not just in a way that's like, taken for granted, but immersed into, and every footstep and every little piece and part you can appreciate. And it really is, it's profound. It's profound to do that. It's a wonderful prayer practice for sure. Patty, did I see your hand up?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that this week when Ukraine was so much in the news, and I was praying that nothing would be terrible, but I also thought about Putin. Mm-hmm. And I thought about the ways that he is seen through the media and how that informs me and biases me. And I began to pray for him and for me to understand what may be in him, which I don't, but what it is there that is motivating him, and praying just that whatever happens, that all of us can be protected, that we all can learn more. And the thing that I felt a lot of pressure from was the media to create an us versus them kind of attitude. And I was rejecting that. That the part of my prayer was to reject that, to say, I don't know enough, and those are human beings, and they were made by God like I'm made by God. We're connected. And that was really profound for me.
Yeah, once again, that vine image, if that's true, it really does connect all of us. And one of the more challenging prayer practices that I've been reading about is, we're asked to pray for our enemies. So think of the ones that are our so-called enemies. And as we pray for them, what we often find is discovering something along the lines of what Patty just named, a heart opening that allows us to sort of not excuse behavior or whatever, but to learn how to see with God's eyes. That's really what we're talking about here. How does prayer awaken us to what that is? None of us can really say, but when we engage in that, the constancy of prayer and the relationship of prayer, the partnership of prayer, it becomes revealed to us, and we find wisdom there. There's in geology, I did a little bit of this when I was doing, I did a little bit of ski patrol stuff, but it was more about snow. But when we would, when you'd have a snowfall, you'd have to go up to the top, and I didn't do this, but the ski patrol would throw dynamite to blast the snow so that it would all fall down and settle in a way that wouldn't just release when people started skiing on it, because it can obviously be very dangerous. But that whole idea of this angle of repose, whether it's for snow or for rocks, there's a certain position that rocks can sit in where they're just stable on a mountainside. But then there can be circumstances that cause them to move and to tumble, a slight shift. So then, is there a way that, with that image in mind, is there a way that, we've talked about communal prayer and persistent prayer, is there a way that you envision them being able to impact this sort of angle of repose to create motion, and that can work, that can have an impact on the way God, on what God seeks to accomplish here in our world? Can prayer do that? Jane, is that your hand raised?
It is.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then Patty?
Thinking about both what Patty just said about Putin and what you just asked us is, I believe that I am a work in progress, and I'm praying a lot about that God's working in me. But then somebody said, think of your enemies, those you disagree strongly with maybe, in the same way. They're a child of God and they're a work in progress, just like I am. And so when I think about the Putins and others, I try to send my prayer energy, my positive, I believe prayer is a positive energy that we send out into the world, and any faith can send that positive energy out into the world. I believe there are millions of people with different faith practices that send that positive energy out into the world. And so, it's that energy, that God energy that changes hearts. It's not me saying, God, do this, it's me just asking God, work on all our hearts, God, change our heart, soften our hearts so that I might see, but also that Putin might see, soften his heart, open his heart. And that has helped me to pray for my enemies in a, positive way, and not hold as much anger toward them.
Yeah, that's a beautiful broadening perspective here. And I think that is a God's eye, moving towards that God's eye view, that there really is no us
Are they
and
doing?
them. What was that? Oh, there's no us and them. That's where we create these categories. Isn't that what's so much of the problem right now in our public discourse in this country, is that we've created such a compartmentalization about camps, and we've lost really a significant sense, at least on the broader scale. I think in our communities, it's still very strong, but we've lost a broader sense of really being with and for one another as human beings, or as citizens of this country at the very least. But and so prayers like that, I hope and I think and I believe can shape that, and can maybe be, as specific to the question I asked, maybe they can be that thing that can nudge that rock, as more of us engage in that way of praying and living. Patty, did you have something that you wanted to add?
I did. And one of the perspectives that helps me is something I learned in seminary when I was working with Pace Bene, which is a peace group. And they taught us about the 8 stages of change. And one of the things about the 8 stages of change, there's a whole bunch to the 8 stages of change, but it is 2 things. One is being an ally, and not just to people in your group, but beginning to understand being an ally, not to the ideas of other people, but to the spirit, the soul of other people who are not people that you like, and finding ways to be an ally, to communicate that. And also that as we get closer to change of something that's major, it looks like we're failing. That the more you try to get something to change, the harder those who don't want it to change speak up. And so it's really a scary place. It's stage 5, I think, or 6. And you may have to endure a lot of what you might call failure.
Yes.
But when you think about, like we just had, I've been working a little bit on the homeless stuff over here in Placerville, and we just had an opportunity to buy a hotel, and we've been using it to house the most vulnerable homeless. And the council, we all wrote letters, but the council voted against it, right? So the hotel's going to go away, and now how are we going to help these people? And I felt real failure in that. But then I thought, okay, all of us wrote letters, lots of letters. maybe we didn't win this time on that, and maybe we're supposed to find another way than that. But those kinds of things are part of the steps that make change happen. And sometimes it takes a long time, and I may not get to see it, but it matters that we wrote the letters. It matters. It matters that we look at this campus of hope that we're looking at here in Auburn, and that there's going to be a petition, and it matters that we sign it and get support for that. And we may not be able to do what we want to do, but it matters that we try, and then we learn from what the trying does. And that perspective has freed me a lot from the ideas of failure, because failure is just a way of learning what has to change.
Yes. Yes, so well said. I mean, that's the persistence we're talking about, right? We don't get to see that that every outcome or shifting or things not working out is the end. It's not the end necessarily. And so there's that persistence that allows us to say, all right, so how do we keep moving? I mean, there are so many examples of this, and I think it's so meaningful and valuable and important for each one of us to call those to mind. In much the same way David called to mind his successes in fending off wild animals before he stepped into his battle with Goliath. We call to mind those places in our lives or in our nation's story or in our world story that we say, yes, God was present, and it took a longer time than we thought, or maybe it seemed hopeless, but wow, look at what has happened. And we're not there yet, but look at the shifting we've seen. I call to mind the Bull Connor turning the hoses on children that finally shifted the tide in this country to say enough is enough. But it wasn't just that one event, right? It was all those other events that led up to it that were so painful to watch and to witness and to feel helpless about. But something finally, created a movement that did change that angle of repose and knock that darn rock down the hill, or started it moving. There's where hope can happen. And so I ask each one of you in your own ways, what are those other areas that you can call to mind readily, have them ready, that where God sort of accomplished something through the hearts of people rather than just fixing it with a magic wand, that sort of thing. But where are those things that where the angle of repose, so to speak, was shifted, and we've witnessed it and we hold on to it? Not that it's the finished product, because that's rarely the case. It's a movement. It's an arc. It's a shaping. Have those in mind, and the role that prayer can play. Prayer is what sets us up to finally be ready to be that ally or that witness. But it's not a passive thing at all, is it? That's what's so interesting about prayer. We often, present it, or maybe we think of it as just this sort of quiet, removed time. And yet, as we're learning and talking, prayer is exactly the opposite. It's a quiet time often, but it's an engaged time. It's something that draws us in. It's that equips us for something. It connects us. It almost is like plugging in our Tesla or something like that. We're getting charged through prayer, and we're taking it in because we want to be connected to the source, of that which motivates and moves and shapes. Comments, if any? Horty.
In doing hospice work and doing home health work and going into people's homes as a solitary member of a healthcare team at a time, you're never a solitary member, but sometimes you're the only one there in the house. And there's this awareness of terror that I'm going to be asked to do brain surgery while I'm there. And I'm there by myself. There's not an operating room, and there's not blah, blah, blah. And I remember one of our chaplains helping us to recall frequently that our life journey has developed in each of us a backpack, a tool chest. And we may not have awareness of what we've learned in each of the steps of our life, but they're there. They're there. And we can access them. We can bring them out.
Yeah.
We can recall them, whether they are in a particular memory of a particular thing, it's still there within us to help us move forward in a way that has hopefully some wisdom, or at least some intention for wisdom.
Yeah. Beautiful. Beautiful. And to be reminded of that, the role we have to play, and to kind of not lose sight, because it's often, it can get easy in some instances to want to just pull back and throw our hands in the air when we feel overwhelmed or ill-equipped. And then to be called back to, all right, well, here's the equipment you do have. Here's what you are holding. So bring that to bear. I love the image from the Lord of the Rings, the one that Peter Jackson did, because I know Amazon is coming out with a new one, but the third movie, the Return of the King, when they're climbing the mountain finally, and Frodo, who carries the ring and must carry the ring himself, it's his charge, it's his journey. He's breaking down and he's just steps away. It's kind of like what Patty was saying. It's just when it seems like abject failure, when they're that close. And Samwise, his dear friend, says that powerful line. He's like, when they're just laying there and they're almost about to give up. And he says, I can't carry this burden. I can't carry this ring for you, but I can carry you. And it's just so profound. It's so beautiful. And to me, it speaks to what those biblical passages we read, the James one, the Acts one, that how do we care for those around us who are in need? We can't take away the burden. We can't take away the struggle, but we can certainly be engaged. And I ask you, as we're considering prayer and our relationship to it, and kind of, we've been using the word partnership a lot in prayer, how do those couple passages we read from Acts and James, and I'll call them back up so you can just have them in front of you again, how do those kind of convey what the early church thought about holding each other, being with each other, being in community together? How do those convey that, how we accomplish God's will on earth? And how do your experiences of modern Christianity meet those? I would maybe even compare, but just where have we gone in terms of some of those early ideas? And again, once again, I'll leave that question as I share the screen again, so you can see those Acts and James passages, knowing that because these are up, I can't necessarily see your hand if it's raised because of the way my screen's set up. So please just speak. And if you hear someone else speaking, just acknowledge it and hold off for the next one. But anyone care to speak to that?
Well, I was struck again by the James one because of the gathering in.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we are doing more than just, as it says here, go in peace, keep warm, and eat your fill. It means nothing unless we open the doors to Overmiller, welcome them in, give them a hearty meal and a place to spend the night.
And Carol, what you say is so true. And I want to say this, a lot of people, when things happen in the world and, everyone tweets thoughts and prayers or that, it's not to discount that. That is still an important piece, but it's just not sufficient. It doesn't have the same impact as actually following through and then saying, all right, it's not just about thoughts and prayers. Where am I in this? Where are we in this? That sort of thing. And only by that persistent prayerful practice of constantly opening our perspective, broadening our lens, trying to see through God's eyes, appreciating the broader tendrils of this vine that we're talking about. That's how we have a chance to grow in that way, to move beyond some of those ways that we take the easy path sometimes with prayer. and to really then engage, as you're saying, to step in. And it doesn't look, it can be simple. And in fact, it's best that it's simple, because that's what we are often able to do. And it feels empowering. And that's what that is what's in front of us. So let us do that. Serving a meal is simple, not easy, not same thing, but simple. It's something that is a basic need that we are well equipped to provide. So we do that. And that's a powerful prayer in action right there. Anyone else with further reflection on this early church sort of expression on how we hold one another in community, and then your thoughts on how the modern church does that, how in your experience? I see Patty. Go ahead, Patty.
The idea of works, because I was somebody who, before I got pneumonia 3 times, used to go to our shelter and work there. And then the doctor said, you're not doing that anymore. But the one thing that I used to feel like, boy, this is such a pittance. We need to do so much more. This is a waste of time. It's not a waste of time. I don't believe that anymore, because partly what you just said matters, that we feed people that are hungry, and it matters that we provide shelter for people who don't have shelter. But it is also to recognize, but it doesn't solve the problems long term. But it makes you look at the problems long term. And when you start to look at the problems long term, you try to think, how do we solve that? And I think the way God works is you start here and you get there. And there is a wondrous journey, but it's not an easy journey. And it requires persistence, but it requires a bigger picture than feeding, but helping. It requires just you to see the soul of the persons as your soul, as part of you. And how do we create a world that allows us to live in harmony with one another? So it will take you to the whole ideas of colonization. The way that our government is a colonizing government and has been forever, and does it with its money and power. It takes you to ideas of what was Christ trying to teach us? And what are we really about here? I mean, we're learning that we're not the good guys. We're not the bad guys either. We're just guys. I mean, girls too. We're just people who are struggling to find ways to be better. The fact that we're trying to do that is really heartening. The fact that we haven't done it well enough yet, it may be the challenge. But by golly, just the fact that we're church is heartening. Yeah. Yes. The fact that we ask those questions of ourselves and each other draws us closer to bigger questions. And that's a real ride. It's a real ride. I mean, I'm just going to do this as a side. I just was reading a book called The Boys in the Boat. And I don't know if you know that book. It's about the 1936 Olympics and the rowers that were from Seattle, Washington, who made that. They were all poor people, but they beat out all the Harvard guys and everything. But the thing that was the most important about it, which to me is about God, is that they got to a place where they trusted one another. They trusted one another. I mean, I think we have a problem with trusting one another. And to trust one another, you have to trust yourself to trust one another. And when they did that, something happened to their rowing, which is called swing. And it's a way of rowing where you are empowered. It's not a power over kind of rowing, which is the kind of rowing we do as a nation sometimes. It's the kind of thing that Christ is talking about, I think, where you stop thinking and you act in concert with the kingdom of heaven. You act in concert with it. And what it does to you is what they reported is it was an out-of-world experience. It was an in-world, out-of-world experience. It was an effortless way to move.
Amen.
That was so exciting. Great book. Beautiful, true story. I don't know if anybody else has read it, but it's so much about God and the kingdom of heaven and the harmony that we are seeking that is there. It's just incredible. And it was like a prayer for me coming back at me. So,
Well, I think it brings up so many
Can I
of the
say something
themes that
real
we've been
quick?
talking about. So Bonnie, you
I'm
wanted to
worried
add
about,
something?
yeah, is Margaret okay? Oh, you're just taking a nap.
No, she's
I
right
just-
there. Oh,
Okay, well, she
Oh.
was like this, and I just want to make sure you're still breathing.
oh, okay.
I'm sorry, but I'm
No,
so
Pete,
worried
that's
about you.
good.
That's
Good.
not a problem at all.
It's exactly what we're meant to do.
Yeah, no, that's it. Pay attention. Thank you for saying that.
Sorry,
And I
Margaret.
want to chime in. And, you know, one of the greatest sports memories of each of our lives was the Miracle on Ice in 1980, and that movie that picks up that story. I think it does a very beautiful job telling the story. The whole formation of that team was along the same lines of what you just said. Herb Brooks, the coach, did not select the best college players, the best players in the country. He selected the ones he thought would make the best team because he realized he couldn't compete at that time with the Soviets, who had all professionals on their team. So it's a very similar approach. And I think finding these examples, and they're all around us, of how we can sort of step in fully and accomplish something together. It's just, you know, to say that we're all connected and that we're better together than apart is important. But then it's the examples like what Patty just said and what your lives know. And it's also the prayer, the practice of prayer, which helps it to sink in like water over time and really land deeply in us and help us to live it and believe it, not just lip service it. And because I feel that we know it's true, and yet it can feel overwhelming still at times because we're not quite maybe as engaged or enmeshed in it. And so finding these examples and naming them and having them in our hearts and minds is so vital, because it helps us through those sometimes challenging times, the difficult days when we feel lost or alone, or that it's all up to us, you know, or ill-equipped. So anyone else that wanted to comment on that as we're kind of moving through here? You know, Saint Teresa of Avila famously said that we are the hands and the feet of Christ, the body. We're all a part of the body of Christ, and we are the hands and the feet. And so it's that partnership that we know with God that helps accomplish God's way or you know, God's love in this world. And so what I've noticed, and I wonder if you've noticed too, so many times when I pray for peace in this world, or when I pray for those who are hungry or suffering, or when I pray for those that don't have anyone to love them, I will often hear a voice come back to me, and it says something along the lines of, yes, what about them? What are you doing, Dan, to be a source of love and healing for them? And there are so many times when I hear that prayer and I think, like some of you have said, is that enough? It just doesn't feel like enough. I can only do so much. The starfish one, you know, and all the starfish are on the shore and you're throwing them back in the water and they keep washing up. It's like, how do I keep up with this? Mother Teresa had the same struggle. Is what I'm doing in this little corner of Calcutta really accomplishing anything? She struggled with that her whole career, her whole time doing that work, you know? It is not easy. And yet, that's how the work of God's kingdom happens. It happens because when we connect, when we tune in, when we broaden our perspective, it's something that pulls us in, whatever that looks like. It pulls us in to the vision, to the message, to the purpose, to the will of God. This class has taken us a whole bunch of different, you know, vantage points and paths and ways of understanding and appreciating. But ultimately, I think it comes down to this idea that prayer is our way of being in relationship and partnership with God. Not just asking God to do things for us, but being in connection with God. And so we're praying in order to help see the world with God's eyes, right? And as we do that, we can join in this stream, this greater stream or vine, whatever, this stream of power as it breaks loose. And see, that's the thing. We don't get to predict when and where it might break loose, but just know that somehow, some way, sometime it will. And that is exciting. But it can't happen when we're disconnected, or when we're haphazard. Or I shouldn't say it can't happen, but it's not as apt to happen because partnership requires more mutuality, more connection, more persistence, more constancy than that. It's challenging, but that's one of my takeaways. I would ask you to reflect on that, maybe make comments on that. Maybe you don't agree, or maybe other things, other takeaways that this conversation over these 6 sessions has garnered, has led you to sort of think and feel, or, what are some of those things? What are the takeaways then for you from this conversation we've been having? Horty?
Somehow your analogy of water trickling over, around, under, and through has raised the question for me, how do I allow the possibility of others praying for me to affect me? How am I carried? Can I let that happen as much as I want that to happen for those for whom I'm praying? Are there the times when I'm not the active ingredient? I'm not the problem solver. I don't have the energy. Does that mean that the energy is no longer flowing? Have I blocked that as much as we may feel Putin's blocking our blessings of him?
Yeah. Maybe it's enough to contribute to the prayer and trust that the energy, you're at least not a block for the energy, so it still can flow through to find its way. Because it can get overwhelming, to think, oh, this is up to me. Well, it is and it isn't. That's always true. It's not an either or.
Receiving is action also.
Yes. And to challenge ourselves, of course, that we don't fall into the same pattern that then becomes a means of kind of passing it all the time. But yet that action, there are times in our lives when that is all we can maybe do. And that is enough, that we're a part of that greater stream, because that's the stream of power we're talking about. And as we know, water, and it is such a great image, isn't it? Because water will move any rock, will cut through anything over time. Over time it will. And so we keep that stream going. We participate in that stream. It's not all about us. We don't know where the stream starts, but we're part of it. Streams, vines, see, it's such powerful imagery that just, it breaks open my own appreciation of what prayer is and what it can be. Any other reflections as we come to this place of kind of maybe closing this, not closing the conversation, but finishing it up for this time and moving on to deeper reflection, maybe coming back to it at some point. But what are some of your takeaways? I saw a boy's hand.
Look out.
Always am.
I think I've mentioned before that I see God as this great buddy friend that is constantly with me, whether I want God to be or not. Always there, always helpful, always loving. This is wonderful, wonderful friend. And as we have been talking, I now visualize, yes, there is the prayer where you bow your head, close your eyes, and either thank or ask for things or whatever, and you're talking to God in a more formal way. But I think now I'm believing that my whole life is a prayer. Every second of the day, I am praying, and God knows. So when I'm frustrated with something, God knows I'm frustrated. I don't have to tell him. When I'm angry, when I'm come to some kind of a dilemma, when I've tried to take a nut off of a bolt and twisted the bolt off and broke it. Everything is a prayer, and God knows that I need help. And I have changed my word of faith to believe. To me, that is a much deeper, if you believe something, you really respond and act according. Having faith, I felt, oh yeah, I can have faith that that's going to happen, but believing it, it will happen.
Yeah.
And so anyway, my perspective through this whole thing, I really like this idea of every day is, every moment, a prayer, and God knows it, knows what I need better than I do. So I really have to watch out what I ask for. I don't want to ask for something specific. And obviously, I make mistakes all the time with that and forget, oh, God's here.
Mhm.
But I think one, I don't know if it was Patty that mentioned joining the ministry thing and realizing that there's a lot more to ministry than just standing on a pulpit and preaching. But to me, Jesus was a great teacher, and he used the most effective teaching method, which is modeling. And our actions are ministering constantly. And how we treat other people, how we acknowledge other people, how we help other people, all of that is ministry, whether or not we're thinking that we're ministering to them. Our kids pick up things that we don't want them to pick up because of our behavior, and they learn from that. And so as we go through life, we're constantly ministering, but also we're constantly in prayer.
Amen. Two things I'll say that just to follow up that one of the greatest shifts from the early church to the modern church is the understanding of that very word you used, Boyce, called belief. And in the early church, and the fullness of the word belief was that belief means that which you give your full self to, that which you give your heart to, that which you beloved. That's what belief means. In the modern world, we've made it very much a cognitive thing. And that's really unfortunate, because it allows us to sort of have many ideas of what appropriate church action is just to believe in our head and not necessarily have connection there in how we live and what it really asks of us. It's not to say that it's all up to us, but there is a partnership that was always a part of the word believe that leads to passages like Acts 2, okay, and James and those types of things. That's powerful. And I think the church at its best will go that way, will work that way. And then the other idea that you raised, being a friend of God, it's such a powerful image, but it's not just about being a chum, is it? It's not just that person who kind of has your back all the time. That's part of it. But a real friend is also the one that sees us and calls us out because they know us and they trust us and they believe in us. And Jesus used that language with the disciples to say, I no longer call you servants. Now I call you friends, because you know, you've seen, you've lived it. So now go and continue and carry on the message. That's what being a friend of God is a charge. It is a way of living. It's a commitment. So beautiful images, and I think that speak profoundly to what we've been, this whole idea of what prayer is and the difference that it can make, what it calls us to. It calls us to deeper engagement with our world and with our God. Was there another hand that was up, or anyone else that has any kind of just reflections, takeaways from this whole class or from today's class? Bonnie?
Well, what happened?
You're good. We can hear you.
Oh, I totally lost my picture. So I don't know what happened.
We can still see you, or
Oh,
I
I
can.
can't. I
Yeah.
gotta ditch the 40-minute limit. It
Oh,
popped up.
okay. Okay.
But anyway, well, I just wanted to thank you for doing this, because I asked you if you would do something on prayer, because I was really wondering, is it worth it? Does it make a difference and all of that? So this has really helped me. And I've even told a couple of people, I feel like I'm growing through this class and through hearing the input of other people, as well as the different, Bible passages that you have shared with us. So I think I'm no longer wondering, does it make a difference? Is it important? But I think I have a much broader definition of it than I used to.
That means the world to me, Bonnie.
Well, thank you.
I gain so much by all of your commitment and your comments, your wisdom. Just the fact that you show up week to week means the world to me, because it means that this matters. And so now it's about how do we continue to make it matter? How do we grow in what that looks like? And in that regard, I'm always growing right alongside you. As a minister, it is not a pulpit job. It is a down with everyone else, finding our way, sometimes through the darkest parts, but also sometimes we find a light with one another. And that's what these classes feel like, is that we're giving ourselves space to sometimes find clarity and sometimes fumble our way around, but to do it in a place of community and love and acceptance is one of the greatest joys of not only the work of ministry, but just of humanity. Just this being in community like this and talking about stuff that matters and seeking to embrace it and live it. This is a big part of what it all is about. So I appreciate that you're all giving yourselves to it, and that somehow, some way, we're finding a heart hold to continue down the path, and to grow in it. That means the world to me. So thank you.
Thank you.
Now I can
Thanks
see.
again.
We look forward to the next one.
All right. Well, I have loved doing this class with you. I hope everyone that's watched it online has also enjoyed it. And as the notes say, stay tuned. And as I mentioned at the beginning, it'll be a couple-week hiatus, but I'll be back with you. Of course, if anyone has any suggestions, that's always appreciated too, because that's always fun to do things that maybe people have had a hankering to study that we haven't done yet. But just know that you can reach out to me. And if I don't do it this next time, well, I'll keep it in the hopper, because we're just going to keep going, right? So anyway, thank you all so much for your participation in this class. And I look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you, everyone.
We vote for the mystery.
Yeah.
One way or another, it's always about mystery, right?
And
All right. Thank you.
it's
friends.
about how precious everyone is.
God bless everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
God
you,
bless
everybody.
you all.